I'm going to start this morning in Genesis 5, and I'm going to read, and then I'll be jumping down through the passage. I won't read all 4 chapters, obviously, this morning, but I'll just let you know where I'm going so that you can follow along. Genesis 5, I'm starting at verse 28. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son and called his name Noah, saying, "Out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands." Lamech lived, after he fathered Noah, 595 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days Lamech were 770 years, and he died. After Noah was 500 years old, Noah fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Let's jump down to chapter 6, verse 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, "I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them." But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Now these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their ways on the earth. And God said to Noah, "I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, its breadth, 50 cubits, its height, 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark and finish it to a cubit above, and set the door of the ark in its side. Make with it lower, second, and third decks. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you." Let's jump down to chapter 7, verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and all the windows of the heavens were opened, and the rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And on the very same day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah's wife and the 3 wives of his sons with them entered the ark, they and every beast according to its kind, and all the livestock according to its kinds, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind, every winged creature. They went into the ark with Noah, 2 and 2 of all flesh, in which there was the breath of life. And those that entered, male and female, of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and Noah shut him, and the Lord shut him in. Let's jump down to verse 20. Verse 20, "The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep, and all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals, and creeping things, and birds of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed, and the rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters receded from the earth continually." Let's jump down to verse 6. "At the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made and sent forth a raven. It went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. Then he sent forth a dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground. But the dove found no place to set her foot. She was returned to him to the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took her and brought her into the ark with him. He waited another 7 days, and again he sent forth the dove out of the ark. And the dove came back to him in the evening, and behold, in her mouth was a freshly plucked olive leaf. So no one knew that the waters had subsided on the earth. Then he waited another 7 days and sent forth the dove, and she did not return to him any more. In the 601st year, in the first month, on the first day of the month, the waters dried off from the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. So then we'll jump down to verse 20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man. For the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seedtime and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, shall not cease. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and every bird of the heavens and upon everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Down to verse 8. Then God said to Noah and his sons with him, behold, I will establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you, as many came out of the ark. It is for every beast of the earth I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you, and every living creature that is with you, for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When we hear the word judgment, what comes to mind? For a lot of people, the idea of judgment sounds very intolerant. It sounds harsh. It sounds exclusionary. It seems very non-inclusive. It's a word that bothers people because in saying that there is judgment, it means that there is good and that there is evil. And because there is good and evil, people struggle. They will struggle with the idea of judgment. People want judgment. We've seen that, especially in the last 6 months or so, as we've watched our neighbors to the south in the United States, as cases like Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, or George Floyd in Minneapolis, as these situations where there has been what seems to have been an excessive use of force by police or inappropriate methods being used, that people have cried out for justice and judgment, and they have longed for it. As human beings, we want a judgment. We don't want evil to prevail. At the same point in time, people will use words of incredible judgment upon others. They will use language that it's not appropriate to use. So I'm going to say that right up front, okay, kids? So what I'm saying is these are things that people say that are ways of expressing God's wrath and judgment that are not appropriate. People will use the word damn, and they will talk about people being damned, which is a way of expressing judgment. Or people will use the phrase go to hell, which is another way of saying something that is wrong. It's a way of casting judgment on people. We want judgment for others, but for us, we want mercy. We want mercy because we know how mixed our motives can be and how confusing things can be. But for other people, we want justice and judgment. We want judgment to be applied, and yet we struggle to know how to apply it. It's complicated. It's not always so easy to figure out how to apply right judgments. And yet God judges evil. He rightly applies judgment, and it's important that we discover this theme in the Bible. It's not something that just randomly shows From the very outset, God has a plan to deal with sin and wickedness and evil. And that is his plan, which includes the judgment of evil. But how do we make sense of judgment? It's not easy to understand it. It's a complicated subject, and even this morning, we're going to fly over 4 chapters of Genesis, and yet there is so much more that could be said about right administering of justice and a proper judgment that is made. But how do we make sense? How do we make sense of God's judgment? Judgment upon sin, upon wickedness, and upon evil. I want us to see 4 things from this story of Noah as we trace through the narrative. And where do we start when we think about God's judgment? We need to start where the Bible starts, and that is we start with grace. Now, you might wonder, why did I start in Genesis 5 and pick up the end of a genealogy? Often when we read a genealogy in the Bible, we skip through it. We read over it, the list of names. In this genealogy, in Genesis 5, it's come from, first, there have been the children of Adam and Eve in Genesis 4, Cain and Abel, who've ended up in a conflict, a mortal conflict where Cain kills his brother Abel, and Cain is following in the ways of the serpent, and he becomes jealous, and it creates evil, and this evil just continues to spread and to spread and to spread. And when we come to the genealogy in Genesis 5, what we find is that there is this pattern. It's repeated on almost every instance. So-and-so lived X number of years. And then they had this son. And then they lived so many more years. And then he died. In almost every case, it ends with, and he died. Which is where the Apostle Paul will pick up this phrase in Romans 5, verse 14. He will say, death reigned from Adam. Whereas Adam was to have dominion and rule and reign, it's now death that reigns. It's death after every instance. Death reigns, death reigns. It's coming. But at the end of this genealogy, we find a man named Lamech. And Lamech has a son who is named Noah. And Noah is a man who Lamech has great hope for. And we're told in Genesis 5, verse 29, that when Lamech has this son Noah, he names him Noah on purpose. The name Noah means rest. And the reason he names this son Rest is that, as Lamech will say, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work, from the painful toil of our hands. In other words, there has been an expectation, a hope, a longing in all of Genesis 5 that someone will come from the line of the seed of the woman who will bring about the rest that God had promised in Genesis 2, that there'll be an ability to enter rest. And now Lamech names his son Noah, the one who will bring rest. We've been toiling, working hard, it's been painful, it's been difficult, and this child is the promise. The child of promise who will come and bring us rest. And as Noah comes forth, it's this desire to bring rest in light of the curse, as Lamech says. The ground's been cursed, which Adam experienced. And the longing is that the curse will be reversed. The world, you see, it's been descending into chaos, into death. As Genesis 6 will begin to tell us that as the Lord looked upon the earth, what he saw was the intentions and evil in every heart and violence which filled the world. It's a contrast to the creation where in Genesis 1, God had said he made this and it was good. But now in Genesis 6, God looks upon the world that he has made and it is evil. It's a total contrast. That the good world has become an evil world. That the ways of Cain have dominated the world. That evil is spreading and it's spreading over. And so now we get this hint that God is going to start over. He's going to start with a new creation. He's going to make things new. And the way that he is going to make things new is by grace. We're told at the end of Genesis 6, verse 8, but Noah found, in English we have that word, favor in the eyes of the Lord. It's the word for grace in the Old Testament. That Noah found, he received grace, that God was showing grace to this one man, that God's judgment would begin with a word of grace. And as God speaks a word of grace, he chooses this man in order to bring the rest that was designed at the very beginning in the fabric of creation. And God gives him a command and tells him how he's going to bring judgment. And he says in chapter 6, verse 18, I'm going to make a covenant with you. I'm going to establish a covenant with you. And in establishing this covenant, it's going to be a continuation of the promises that I made to Adam. And this covenant it's an agreement. It's a binding agreement. It's a binding agreement of unconditionality. If I said that right. There's an unconditional nature between the two parties. And that there are blessings and there are consequences. Blessings for following the covenant, consequences for not following it. And every covenant in the Bible has both an unconditional nature and a conditional nature. And in every covenant, God is establishing this relationship. And the reason for the covenant, as God lays it out in the verses that precede it, is that he is going to establish a new creation. And we get that hint because as God talks about the beasts of the field and the birds of the air and the creatures that creep, he uses the same language of Genesis 1, that according to their kind, which gives us the hint that what is happening here is that what God is going to do is that his grace is going to make something new. Just like God had all of the creatures according to their kind in Genesis 1, now according to their kind in Genesis 6, something new is going to happen. In all of God's ways. And this is by faith that we say this. In all of God's ways, all that he does is good. Every trial, every hardship, every grief, every sorrow, every pain, God is working for good. And when he works for good, it begins with grace. He chooses a man, not because Noah is deserving, but because God is gracious. He reveals a rescue plan, a plan to save the world, and he brings about something new. But when God sees evil, he will deal with evil. But in dealing with evil, it does not mean that he has forgotten grace. So we see that we start with grace. But as we move into what happens, the account of Noah really is an account where we're called to believe in judgment. That's the second thing I want us to see. In chapter 7, as Noah builds this ark, as he frames it up, it takes him 120 years to frame up this enormous ark. 3 layers in order to have all of the animals, everything there. Noah builds this ark in preparation for a judgment that he's never seen. What do I mean he's never seen it? He's being asked to build a boat for a flood, for a storm. There's never been a flood. There's never been rain. And he's building a great, humongous boat in the plains. He's not building it on the edge of the ocean. He's building it in the plains. In other words, when Noah has received the word of God, he's believing it. He's believing that there is a judgment that is going to come. In 120 years, Noah is this preacher of righteousness, declaring to another generation that God will not endure with evil forever, that he will deal with evil. And so Noah preaches a message both of God's coming judgment and that there is a way to be rescued from it, a way to flee from the wrath that is to come. And as the judgment comes, Noah goes into the boat. He, along with the animals that God brings, 7 pairs of animals, if they were clean, 2 animals who are unclean, he takes them into the boat. He takes the seeds of the earth for replenishment and for planting into the boat. And as he does this, what we find is there is this process in Genesis 7 of a decreation. The world becomes not a place of life, but a graveyard. That what began as God speaking life in Genesis 1 is now a world of death in Genesis 7. That where God had separated the waters from the land in Genesis 1, now the waters and the earth are covering one, the waters cover the earth. That where there was only good at the beginning of creation, now there is only evil intentions in every heart of man, as Genesis 6 says. And God begins this process of decreation. And the reason is that God will not be mocked. The evil of the serpent must be stopped. It must come to an end, and God will send his servant. And he will send his servant in order to bring a message of rescue and of something new. There is no rest. There is no rest that is found in the heart when humans call evil good and good evil. And Isaiah 5:20 makes that clear. There's no rest for the wicked. There's never the calming of the heart, the quietness of the soul. God will not be mocked. God takes no delight in the death of the wicked, as Ezekiel will say in Ezekiel 18, but God must deal with evil. It can't go on. He starts with grace, but you must believe that there is a coming judgment. But the coming judgment isn't the final word, that we await for the renewal. And this is what happens as Noah goes into the boat and the world becomes this graveyard. And we're told in chapter 7 that every living thing that had breath in its lungs, it dies. But at the end of this account in Genesis 7, as the waters now, the floods stop, the waters are no longer increasing, what we find at the beginning of chapter 8 is the renewal of all things. And what happens in Genesis chapter 8 is that we're told that the Lord God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth. This is just like Genesis 1, where was God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and the wind of God, the breath of God, the Spirit of God hovered over the waters in Genesis 1, verse 2. And as God's breath was blowing in creation, now here God's breath is blowing and blowing the land dry. And just as God had created, He had created sky and land and birds and all living things. In chapter 8, it's as though days 2, 3, 4, and 6 of creation are repeated. And it culminates in chapter 9, where God calls Noah a man who's made in His image, just like Adam, who was made in God's image. And what we're hearing is the repetition of the language of Genesis 1, because God is creating something new. He's creating a new earth, a new world, cleansed and purified of sin and of evil. And as the boat, the ark that Noah is in, it comes to rest in chapter 8, verse 4, it comes to rest on Mount Ararat. And it's interesting that certain details are so specifically given to us. Ararat probably being the location, it's a range of mountains, probably where all those 4 rivers that are mentioned in Genesis 2 flow from. It's similar in that sense. In other words, just as Eden was a mountain, now Ararat is this new Eden. That God is opening up to Noah a brand new creation, fresh, with no mistakes in it. And as Noah goes out of the ark in chapter 9, verses 1, 2, and 3, he functions like a new Adam. He's given the command in verse 1, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, just like Adam was. And he's told to care for the creation in verse 2, just as Adam was to have dominion over the land and to care for it. And in verse 3, Noah is told to enjoy all of the things that God has made, all of the living things, all of this food that is given to him. It's given to him for his enjoyment, just as Adam was told. But the difference now is that evil and good will coexist. That there will be this mixture of the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, the kingdom of evil and the kingdom of good, and that there will be these two that coexist. But God will bring the seed of the woman to fulfillment. He will make all things new. And as Noah goes out, he goes out and he offers a sacrifice at the end of chapter 8, verse 20. And following. Because as God is about to make all things new, we can't just jump to God's going to make all things new without remembering the promise. And that's the fourth thing I want us to see, is I want us to see that God remembers his promise. And we ought to remember that too. As Noah goes out, we're told in chapter 8 that he offers a sacrifice of the clean animals that were in the ark with him. And not all of them, but there's a portion here offered on this. And it's as though what Noah is doing is this act of offering an atoning sacrifice. Because we're told at the end of chapter 8, I think it's in verse 22, that when the Lord smells the aroma, it's pleasing to him. And it's as though his wrath is turned away from sin. That what was judgment and God's intention to destroy evil is now dealt with. And his wrath is removed as the sacrifice is offered. God's justice is now satisfied, and the covenant that God made, that he promised, that he said he would continue, the covenant with Adam, which is now being formally established here with Noah, God shows that he is fully committed to his word. And how do we know that? He says, I'm going to put my bow in the sky. Now, it's very rare that I'll disagree strongly with the notes in the ESV Study Bible, but in the ESV Study Bible it will say something like, there is no indication that the bow mentioned here has any connection to a weapon, which I would say, I'm sorry I disagree, but the language that is used when God's bow is hung is also the language of a warrior's bow. It's the same Hebrew word. That God is saying, I'm hanging my weapon of war up into the sky. I'm done with war. I'm hanging it up. And by hanging it up, I'm showing you that I will no longer use my weapon of war against you, but rather that this bow is now pointing upwards, that the blow is not going to go towards earth, it's not going to go towards the ground, it's not going to go to where the curse is, it's going to go up into the heavens. That I'm going to take the blow. I'm the warrior, and I'm hanging up my bow of war. I'm done. But that doesn't mean that he's done with dealing with evil. Just that he won't destroy everything. Now, in all of this, the story of Noah, this true account that we have, is intended for us to see the glory of Christ. And I want us to see a couple things about the glory of Christ in the account of Noah. Too often, The account of Noah is used to talk about geology formations and how the earth has been reformed. And those are wonderful conversations, but that's not the primary point. The point of the flood narrative is to point us to Christ, pointing to Jesus. And the story is not for us to debate geology, but it's for us to understand faith, judgment, salvation, and new creation. It's the story of faith because, as the writer of Hebrews will say in Hebrews 11, verse 7, he says, "By faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith." This story is a reminder that we don't see all of God's plans worked out immediately, that we go by faith. But the second thing that we see in the account of Noah is that God will judge the earth. This is what Noah, he doesn't see it, but he believes it. He believes that there is a coming judgment. And so Jesus can say to those who are listening to his teaching in Matthew chapter 24, verses 36 and following, he can talk about not only the judgment that Noah experienced, but how this is a sign of God's final judgment. Jesus will say, "But concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man." As Christians, we believe that there is a coming judgment. Though it doesn't make sense, we don't see it, we believe that God will ultimately and finally deal with evil. That his dealing with evil in Genesis 6 through 9 is only partial, only temporary. But one day he will decisively deal with it fully and finally when his Son returns. But it's not only a picture of a warning of this judgment, but it's also a message of salvation. That you can flee from the wrath to come. That you can find that there is a place of rescue. As Peter will say in 1 Peter 3:18, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water." God is going to bring a salvation, and he says it's in Jesus. And in passing through the waters of judgment, there is this passing from death to life. And Peter makes this connection when he says in chapter 3, verse 21, "Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience." In other words, the very act of fleeing to Christ is going into the ark. And that in going to the ark, you find that the waters of judgment don't sweep over you, but rather that you're rescued and that you pass through them. And the way that we symbolize that is through the act of baptism. Have you been baptized? In being baptized, we go under the water. We've died to our old way of life. We've died to sin. We've died to death. And we are risen out of the waters of judgment, being brought into the ark of Christ, where we find that our consciences are cleansed, that we have purity in our hearts and lives. And so, there is this message, not only of judgment, but God's judgment. His salvation comes through judgment and mercy. But that's not the final thing. When God hangs up his bow into the sky and he says, "Never again will I destroy the earth." I read to you from Isaiah 54, verses 9 and 10 at the call to worship this morning. Just as in the days of Noah that the Lord showed his wrath and his anger upon sin, he won't do that anymore. And the reason that he won't do that anymore is that he has, as Isaiah says of the Lord, he has sworn that I will not be angry with you and I will not rebuke you. For the mountains may depart and the hills be removed, but my steadfast love shall not depart from you, and my covenant of peace shall not be removed, says the Lord who has compassion on you. And God, who is full of grace and mercy, do you want to know how much his heart is full of grace and mercy? That in Revelation 4, when we get the picture of God on his throne, what surrounds his throne are not only these precious jewels, but a rainbow. That God's throne is surrounded with this rainbow, which is a reminder that God is forever gracious, forever compassionate. That the sign of his covenant surrounds his throne, that he's a God who is aiming for peace. He doesn't delight in the wicked. He doesn't delight in destruction and death. What he delights in is to bring his new creation to make all things new. He says even of us, as Paul will say in 2 Corinthians 5, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. We are the beginning of the evidence that God is making things new. Yes, evil and good coexist. Yes, our motives are mixed. But in all of these things, friends, can I just say to you that no matter what you experience, no matter how hard things are in your life, no matter the trial that you're going through, that God is gracious even in the trials and the difficulties, in the pains you experience. He is making you his new creation. And it makes you long for a better day. The day where there will be no more tears or sorrow or sadness, where he'll wipe that all away. It'll be done. It'll be dealt with. That evil will be done, that we will no longer hear the genealogy that says, and he died. We will only hear the words, and he lives forever. And the story of Noah is painted across our sky again and again and again to remind us that you can endure the hardships. As Peter will say in 2 Peter chapter 2, that if God who, 2 Peter 2:5, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, verse 9, then he knows how to rescue the godly from their trials. He knows how to rescue you. He knows how to rescue me. If he did it for Noah, he'll do it for you. This week on Wednesday, we had a storm pass through. As I was leaving the church parking lot, I snapped this photo. Maybe it's not as clear on the PowerPoint, but I snapped this photo. I just got out of the vehicle. I looked at the rainbow. As best as I could, I tried to take a picture of it. As I looked at it, I tried to remember the very precious promise of God. That all the hardships and trials and difficulties, God will keep you. He'll make things new. His sign is in the sky. And so as I went home, I tried to write these words. When God hung up his bow, he said, I'll take the blow. So he sent his only Son, and they pierced the Holy One. And just as judgment ends, the bow says, mercy reigns, for the reign of judgment's done when to the cross I come. God's mercy is so great for you and me in Jesus Christ that we await for the day that he makes all things new.